The morning the church bells rang across the dusty little town, folks thought it would be a day like any other wedding day. The sky hung low with a pale golden light, the kind that settles over the old frontier like a quiet blessing. Riders came in from the ranches, storekeepers closed their doors early, and even the children were told to stand straight and mind their manners. But beneath all that calm, something uneasy hung in the air. People whispered behind gloved hands. Some said the bride had agreed to the union, others claimed she had been promised away without a word of her own. In a place where families held tight to tradition, no one dared speak too loudly. Yet everyone felt the wrongness of it stirring under the surface. She stood inside the small room beside the church altar, her fingers winding around the lace veil like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her dress was fine and white, stitched by the older women of the town, but it rested on her shoulders like a weight she could not shake off. She had not chosen this dress, not chosen the man waiting for her at the front of the church, not chosen the path others decided she should walk. She felt the whole town pressing in, expecting her to smile, to nod, to become someone's wife simply because it had been arranged that way. Her breath trembled as she looked toward the window. Outside, sunlight glimmered across the dry earth, but she felt trapped in a place where her voice held little worth. She had tried to speak her fears the night before. She had tried to say she wasn't ready, that her heart wasn't in it, that she wanted time to understand her own future. But the voices around her had been firm. They told her a good woman followed family decision. They said life was easier when one didn't question too much. They said she should be grateful someone as well respected as the groom wanted her at all. She listened, but her heart pushed against every word. Something inside her whispered that her life was her own, that she was meant for something different, something freer, something honest. That whisper grew louder with each passing hour, until she could barely think of anything else. The church pews filled quickly. Men in dark coats shifted uncomfortably. Women clutched their shawls. Children fidgeted under the watchful eyes of their elders. Even the priest kept glancing toward the double doors as though expecting trouble to walk right in. Rumors had circled around for weeks that the nearby Apache band had been seen scouting the outskirts. Ranchers claimed they spotted smoke signals near the ridge. Traders said an Apache warrior had been searching for someone, asking quiet questions, watching the town from a distance. No one knew what he wanted, but everyone knew to stay alert. Folks told themselves he would never dare ride into a church gathering. But even the bravest felt a chill when the wind shifted. The groom stood proudly at the altar, dressed in his best coat. People said he came from land and money, and that he wanted a wife who would bring calm to his home. He smiled at the crowd, but not at her. His eyes held the kind of confidence that came from always getting his way. When the music finally rose and the door opened, the crowd turned. She stepped into the aisle, her veil trembling like a leaf caught in a restless wind. Her steps were slow. Her eyes stayed low. Yet those close enough to see her face knew something was wrong. She wasn't walking toward a future she wanted. She was walking toward one built for her by others. As she moved down the aisle, a strange hush fell over the room. It wasn't the soft kind that fills church walls. It felt heavier, like everyone sensed something about to change. She heard her heart beat more clearly than the music. She felt each breath tight in her chest. Her hands shook slightly, hidden beneath the folds of her skirt. She tried to imagine herself beyond this moment, living a life that didn't belong to her. The more she pictured it, the more her steps faltered. The priest opened his book, cleared his throat, and began the words everyone had heard 100 times before. She barely heard any of it. She only heard the pounding of her heart and the distant echo of hoofbeats carried by the wind outside. Her breath caught. Hoofbeats on a wedding day usually meant late guests or some ranch hand rushing through, but the sound now felt different, steady and strong, growing closer with every second. A few heads turned, then more. The priest paused, his eyes snapping toward the doors. The groom frowned, annoyed. The church walls trembled slightly as the sound came nearer. Outside, the dust rose in spirals as a lone rider approached. A horse galloped with fierce energy, its hooves striking the earth like drums of warning. A figure leaned forward over the saddle, moving with the certainty of a man who knew exactly why he had come, before anyone inside could react. The rider swept past the side path and thundered into view before the open church doors. Gasps filled the room. The horse reared, dust swirling around them, sunlight catching across the rider's bare chest marked with tribal paint. It was an Apache warrior, tall and strong, hair tied back with feathers that rustled in the wind. He sat on his horse with a fierce calm, eyes focused only on her, not on the murmuring crowd or the shocked priest or the stiff-backed groom. Something in his presence felt like a storm moving in. It's unstoppable and wild. She froze at the altar, breath caught in her throat. She had seen him before, though only from afar. Once, near the river, once near the ridge, a watchful soul who looked at her not with ownership or demand, but with understanding. She never spoke to him, but she felt something shift in her each time their eyes met. She never knew why he watched the town, or why he looked at her the way he did, as though searching for something unspoken. Now, as he sat atop his horse in front of the church, that same look burned brighter. The groom barked an order for someone to stop the intruder, but no one moved. The warrior raised his hand, steady and silent, commanding the air itself to hold still. His gaze fixed on her, and for the first time that day, she felt her breath return. Not calmly, but with a jolt of life. Something inside her that had been quiet for too long stirred awake. The warrior extended his arm toward her. Dust shimmered around him, sunlight glowing against the tribal markings on his skin. The whole town watched, barely breathing. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt the moment settling between the two of them. She looked at the groom, then at the priest, then at the waiting crowd. Every face held judgment or confusion or fear. But none of those faces understood her heart. None of them knew how lost she felt. None of them saw the door she wished she could walk through, far beyond the boundaries others had built around her. Her gaze returned to the warrior. His hand remained outstretched, steady as stone, waiting for her decision. Not demanding, not forcing, just waiting. Her pulse pounded. The church walls seemed to close in. Her future pressed hard against her chest, tight and suffocating. She took one step back from the altar, then another. The crowd gasped. The groom shouted. The priest stumbled over his own words. She lifted her skirt slightly and ran toward the open doorway, the sound of her heartbeat roaring in her ears. But before she could reach him, before her hand could touch his, something unexpected happened that made the entire town fall silent once more, leaving everyone unsure of what would happen next. The moment she rushed toward the doorway, with her dress gathered in trembling hands and the wind catching the edge of her veil, time seemed to stretch thin like worn fabric. The entire town stood frozen, unsure whether to reach for her, call her back, or simply let the scene unfold as fate intended. The Apache warrior remained steady on his horse, his arm extended toward her with the same calm strength that had shaken the very foundation of the ceremony. But just as her fingers were about to meet his, the horse shifted, and a group of townsmen at the far side shouted warnings that cracked the still air like dry sticks under boots. She flinched at the noise, her steps faltering, and the warrior's horse reared again, dust swirling beneath its hooves. The noise broke the moment, but it didn't break the pull between the two of them. She stood only a breath away from his reach, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. The warrior didn't retreat, but he didn't surge forward either. Instead, his sharp eyes moved across the gathered faces, reading the crowd the way a skilled hunter reads the land. He seemed to be searching for something, or maybe someone, who might step in his way. His silence held more weight than any challenge spoken aloud. The old sheriff, who had remained near the back of the church, finally pushed his way toward the front. He wasn't quick on his feet anymore, but his voice still held authority. He warned everyone to stay calm, though his own hands shook a little as he rested them on his belt. The groom's face had gone red with rage, but even he didn't dare try to drag her back. Not with the warrior staring right through him like he was nothing more than a broken fence post in the way. She found herself caught between two worlds, both staring at her with different expectations. Behind her were the people who believed they had the right to decide her life. In front of her was a man she barely knew, yet somehow felt drawn to. a man whose presence stirred something inside her she didn't yet understand. She looked up at him again, and in his eyes she didn't see anger or claim. She saw a knowing. She saw a promise she couldn't name. But before she could take the final step toward him, the warrior lowered his hand. Not in rejection, but in caution. His gaze shifted beyond her, toward the far edge of the street. A faint sound carried on the wind, something sharp and distant, like metal striking rock. The warrior straightened on his saddle. His horse's ears flicked forward. Something was coming. Something no one in the crowd understood yet. Fear edged into the whispers. The sheriff called out again for calm, but this time fewer people listened. Folks began glancing over his shoulders, wondering if another rider was approaching or if there was danger they didn't yet see. The warrior seemed to sense something long before anyone else, and his jaw tightened. His eyes shot back to her, urging her silently to stay close. Though he still hadn't spoken a single word since arriving, the groom tried to grab her wrist as panic grew, but she pulled away, instinctively moving a step toward the warrior even without his hand guiding her. This simple movement made the crowd erupt into louder whispers. Some begged her to stop. Some called for the sheriff. Some insisted the Apache had come to take her against her will. Others muttered that maybe she didn't want the groom after all. The town, once united by routine and tradition, now broke into confusion. The warrior shifted his weight, preparing for whatever he sensed in the distance. Even without words, he made it clear he hadn't come only for her. Something else drove him here, something larger than the wedding itself. She felt it too, a ripple of tension that raised goosebumps across her skin. The sound in the distance came again. A low rumble like wheels moving fast over uneven earth. Then more voices. Not from the town, not from the church. Voices approaching with purpose. The warrior's horse scraped the ground impatiently, and a few of the braver townsmen stepped closer to the doorway, curiosity mixing with fear. The sun had begun to shift behind a thin layer of clouds, casting a pale shadow over the street. Making everything feel more uncertain, she backed up slightly. Caught between wanting to run toward the warrior and wondering if stepping outside would put her right in the path of whatever danger was coming, her breath felt thin. The groom barked orders again, demanding the sheriff do something. Anything. But the sheriff's focus was on the horizon. The warrior finally pulled lightly on the reins, positioning his horse sideways as though shielding her from the open street. It was a small gesture, subtle and quick, but meaningful enough to make her heart jolt. He was protecting her, even without touching her, even without speaking. The crowd saw it too, and their confusion grew deeper. A wagon came into sight from around the bend, moving faster than any wagon had reason to move that close to town. Dust rose behind it. The wheels bounced hard on the rocky path. 2 men sat at the front, both armed. Not lawmen, not traitors. They looked rough, desperate, like men running from or toward trouble. The wagon carried crates covered with torn cloth, and the horses pulling it looked half wild from fear. Shouts rose from inside the church. As more people rushed to the doorway to see what was happening, the groom cursed under his breath, clearly realizing the day was unraveling faster than he could control. The priest clutched his book tight against his chest, unsure whether to step forward or retreat inside. Children cried as their parents tugged them back. Unsure if this new arrival meant danger, the warrior's eyes locked on the wagon. The muscles in his arms tightened as he steadied his horse again. He knew these men, or he knew what they carried. Something about those crates made him lean forward with the kind of tension that only comes from facing an old enemy or unfinished trouble. She watched him closely, sensing the shift in him. The way his jaw hardened, the way he silently braced himself. The wagon thundered closer and halted just yards from the church steps. One of the armed men jumped down, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He scanned the crowd, and when he spotted the Apache warrior, his expression darkened. There was recognition. There was history, and neither of them seemed glad to see the other. The warrior didn't reach for a weapon, but every muscle in his body looked ready for one. The man from the wagon spat in the dust before muttering something sharp and hateful. The crowd stiffened as tension surged like a sudden storm. She watched, heart pounding, stronger than ever. She didn't know who the wagon men were or why the warrior reacted this way, but she felt danger wrapping around the moment like barbed wire. The groom stepped forward and tried to act bold, demanding to know why these men had burst into town on such a day, especially during a wedding. The men barely looked at him. Their focus was on the warrior. The second man climbed down, gripping the side of the wagon as he landed. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered pistol in a way that made the sheriff finally reach for his own, ready but not drawn. The air between the wagon and the warrior crackled with years of unresolved anger. Then the first man spoke. His voice cut through the noise like a blade scraping metal. He said they were passing through. He said they needed no trouble. But the way he watched the warrior told a different story. They weren't just passing through. They came because they knew he would be here. She felt a shiver crawl along her spine. The warrior hadn't come for her alone. He hadn't come to cause a scene or bring chaos to the town. He had come because something dangerous was closing in. Something tied to these men and those crates. The groom shouted again, trying to assert authority he didn't truly have. The sheriff warned everyone to stay calm. The townsfolk murmured prayers and fears. The warrior didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on the armed men. His silence spoke of deep old wounds. His stillness carried the weight of a man who had tracked something for far too long. The bride felt a tightening in her chest as she watched him, realizing she had stepped into a moment much larger than she had imagined. A moment that had been building long before her wedding day. And then, just as the sheriff took a cautious step forward, the warrior turned his head ever so slightly, meeting her eyes again. It was a look that warned her without words that something was about to happen. Something no one in the town was prepared for. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about this place. This day, and the man waiting on horseback, before she could draw a steady breath, one of the wagon men reached for something inside the crate behind him. And the warrior reacted with sudden urgency, his hand moving fast, his horse shifting. The crowd erupting into alarm as the tension finally snapped, but the moment broke again before any answer came, leaving her standing on the church threshold with her heart racing, unsure if the next few seconds would bring rescue, danger, or a truth she wasn't ready to face. The instant the wagon man reached toward the crate behind him, the warrior leaned sharply in the saddle, his entire body braced like a bow drawn tight. Dust curled around the horse's hooves as the animal shifted, sensing the rising danger before anyone else fully understood it. The bride held her breath, gripping the edge of her skirt as the church behind her erupted with frightened whispers. Children cried. Women pulled back. Men stepped forward, unsure whether to help or stay clear. Even the sheriff hesitated. Caught between protecting the town and trying not to spark something worse, the groom stepped in front of her as if to shield her. But she moved aside before he could block her view. She didn't trust his idea of protection. His hands shook more from anger than fear, and the way he stared at the warrior made her stomach twist with uneasy dread. She had seen men like him before, men who believed their pride mattered more than peace. He wasn't standing between her and danger out of concern. He was standing there because he wanted to show he wasn't afraid. But she saw the truth in the way he swallowed hard, the way his voice cracked when he barked for the sheriff to do something. The warrior saw it too. He wasn't watching the groom at all. His focus stayed on the men from the wagon, especially the one lifting the edge of the torn cloth on the crate. The man's hands worked quick, but uneven, like he was nervous or didn't want others to know what he carried. When the cloth slipped enough to reveal part of the cargo, the warrior's jaw tightened so sharply she thought she heard his teeth grind. Inside the crate was metal, cold, heavy shapes stacked in neat rows. Not rifles, not tools. Something sharper. Something meant to cause trouble. She couldn't name the objects from where she stood, but she saw the way the warrior's breath shortened. Whatever those things were, they mattered. They mattered enough for him to ride into town without hesitation. Enough to stand alone in front of a church full of people who didn't trust his kind. Enough to risk his own life to intercept this wagon. The wagon man noticed the warrior staring and slammed the cloth back down, glaring with open hostility. The tension between them deepened, thick as a storm front rolling over the plains. The bride could feel it pressing against her skin. Whatever history the warrior had with these men, it wasn't fresh trouble. This was old. This was something that had begun long before her wedding day. The sheriff cleared his throat and stepped forward, demanding to know what the men were carrying. The first wagon man scoffed, insisting it was only goods they intended to trade in the next settlement. But his voice wavered, and the warrior's silent stare made the lie shake. The townsfolk began whispering again, some backing away toward the church doors, others inching closer to see more clearly. The second wagon man shifted his weight, one hand lingering too long near the pistol at his hip. The warrior noted the movement instantly. His horse tossed its head, sensing its rider's readiness, and the crowd tensed even more. The bride felt torn in two. Her heart still pounded from the moment she almost reached his hand. She didn't know why he had come for her, or if he had truly come for her at all. But she sensed something important. A reason he had watched the town from the ridge. A reason he had appeared at the exact moment she tried to run. It wasn't chance. It wasn't simple defiance. There was meaning behind every move he made. Her mind spun with questions she had no answers for. Had he known about the wagon? Had someone warned him? Or had he followed those men across miles of open land, arriving here at the very moment she thought she'd lose herself forever? These thoughts tangled with her fear and curiosity. Pulling her deeper into the mystery surrounding him, the groom stepped toward the wagon men. Chest puffed out as if he believed himself brave enough to confront them. The warrior gave him a single look, cold and dismissive, and the groom froze mid-step. That silent warning told her more about the warrior's power than any words could. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. His presence alone commanded attention. But the groom wasn't the type to accept being overshadowed. Resentment burned in his eyes. He looked at the bride with a frustrated glare as if blaming her for the entire scene. She felt a chill run through her. She had never liked his temper, but now she saw a deeper crack in him, something brittle and dangerous. He had been embarrassed before the town. Some men never forgave that. The wagon men began arguing with each other under their breath. One insisted they leave before things got worse. The other demanded they finish what they came to do. Their words were too hushed for the townsfolk to catch, but the warrior heard them. His posture shifted again, his muscles coiling with urgency. The bride stepped forward, drawn by a strange instinct to be closer to him. She didn't understand it fully, but something deep inside told her she needed to stay near him if trouble broke loose. She wasn't thinking of safety alone. She felt a pull she couldn't explain. As though her life had suddenly taken a turn she couldn't walk away from. A woman from the crowd grabbed her arm and pulled her back, hissing that she shouldn't move another inch, but she gently shook the hand away. Fear didn't control her anymore. Not after she'd taken those steps toward freedom. Not after she'd felt the warrior's silent call urging her to choose her own path. The sheriff demanded once more to see inside the crates. The wagon man refused, stating it wasn't the town's business. The sheriff stepped closer, while the second wagon man took a defensive stance. The warrior's hand hovered near the rope wrapped around his horse's saddle horn, not grabbing it, but ready. The bride noticed movement behind her. People were slowly pushing back into the church, seeking shelter in case violence erupted. Some urged her to follow. Others begged her to reconsider the choice she almost made. Their voices tangled around her, thick with fear and uncertainty. But she barely heard them. Her eyes were locked on the warrior, and then something unexpected happened. From the far end of the street, 3 more riders appeared. They weren't part of the wedding crowd. They weren't townsfolk at all. They had the look of drifters, moving with an eagerness that made her stomach tighten. They approached fast, kicking up dust behind them. The wagon men saw them too, and exchanged a quick glance that spoke volumes. These new riders weren't strangers to them. The warrior straightened, the tension in him shifting from caution to outright alarm. His horse pawed the ground, restless. The groom backed away as the riders closed in, circling around the wagon like wolves converging on prey. One of them shouted toward the warrior in a harsh tone, calling him out as if he had been expected. The townsfolk panicked. Some ran back inside the church. Others pressed against the walls of nearby buildings. The sheriff pushed people behind him, trying to make space, trying to keep order that was already slipping through his fingers. The rider in the lead pointed at the warrior with a cruel smirk, saying they knew he wouldn't let things go easily. He spoke as if they shared a long, ugly history, one filled with betrayal and unfinished grudges. The warrior still didn't answer, but the tightening of his fists said enough. The bride felt her heart squeeze painfully. She didn't know what the warrior had been through. She didn't know why these men hunted him, but she knew he stood alone, completely alone, and yet he had come here. He had come into a town that might turn against him. He had come into a church filled with people who feared him. He had come for reasons that were still hidden, but she felt herself tangled in those reasons, pulled deeper with every passing second. One of the riders barked orders at the wagon men. Another threatened the sheriff when he stepped too close. The warrior's horse shifted sideways again, placing its powerful body between the men and the bride, as if protecting her out of instinct. The groom saw it and snapped. He screamed that she belonged with him, that the warrior had no right to shield her. His anger cracked through the tense air, but no one dared support him. His claim sounded weak against the growing danger around them. The lead rider turned his eyes on her then, looking her over with a calculating glint that made her skin crawl. He laughed under his breath, calling her the reason the warrior had come here. His tone was mocking, cruel, and she felt herself shrink back at the attention. The warrior shifted sharply, his horse stamping hard, warning the rider without a word. That small movement told her the truth. She mattered in this conflict, whether she understood it or not. She had become part of the reason these men and the warrior had finally crossed paths. The rider smirked wider. He reached down as if to draw something from his saddlebag, and the warrior reacted at once, moving faster than anyone else could. The bride gasped. The townsfolk screamed. The sheriff shouted. But whatever the rider pulled, whatever the warrior intended to stop, whatever was about to explode into chaos, the moment froze for a heartbeat, suspended between danger and the unknown. And the story of that day shifted again, with the bride standing in the middle of it, her life tied to a conflict far older, deeper than anything she'd ever imagined. The rider's hand froze inside the saddlebag, the warrior poised to strike, if even a hint of danger spilled into the dusty air. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stopped moving, as if the whole world waited to see what would happen next. The bride felt her chest tighten, her heart hammering so loudly she wondered if others heard it. Every instinct in her begged her to step closer to the warrior, to stay within the protective reach of the man who had entered her life like a sudden storm. But fear routed her feet to the spot. Not fear of him. Fear of everything happening around him. The rider finally pulled his hand free. Not with a weapon, but with a rolled piece of worn buckskin. He snapped it open and barked something mocking toward the warrior. The people around her didn't understand the words, but the tone carried sharp meaning. The warrior's expression darkened. Whatever message lay written or drawn on that buckskin wasn't meant for the town. It was meant for him alone. He lowered his chin slightly, eyes burning, jaw tightening. He didn't reach for his weapon, but he didn't need to. Every inch of him looked ready for battle. The bride felt a wave of dread settle deep inside her. This wasn't a simple feud. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something about that buckskin carried the weight of a promise or a threat. Tied to the crates on the wagon and the riders who had arrived with such purpose, she had stepped into the center of something she barely understood, but she couldn't pull herself away. She couldn't ignore the connection she felt to the warrior. It was as if the moment she stepped toward him at the church doorway had changed her path completely. The sheriff ordered the riders to put whatever they carried away, but they ignored him. One of them laughed, calling him a fool for thinking he had any control over the situation. The townsfolk backed up quickly, some stumbling up the church steps, others ducking into nearby doorways. People gripped their loved ones' hands, trying to pull children behind them before things turned worse. The groom, shaken but angry, stepped toward the bride and tried to grab her wrist again. Insisting she return to the church, she jerked her arm free, surprising even herself. His eyes flashed with disbelief. He had expected her to obey, to follow the path laid out for her. For the first time, she saw his face clearly. Saw the disappointment mixed with bruised pride and the simmering anger beneath it. She realized then that their planned marriage had never been about her wishes. It had been about convenience and control. Before he could say more, the warrior turned his eyes on him with a silent warning. The groom froze. Even he understood that challenging the warrior now, in front of men who clearly meant harm, would be reckless. The lead rider crumpled the buckskin in his fist and announced loudly that the warrior had something they wanted back. Something that belonged to their hands, not his. His voice boomed down the street, carrying a cruel certainty. At the mention of this unknown thing, the warrior's posture shifted again. He didn't shrink back. He didn't show fear, but something heavy settled in his eyes. A burden he had carried for longer than anyone here realized. The bride stepped closer, though the air buzzed with danger. She didn't touch him, but her nearness made the warrior glance at her for a split second. In that moment, she saw the truth. He had come not only because of the wagon men. He had come because he knew they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And he wanted her safe from the storm that followed him. The second rider finally snapped, shouting that he was tired of waiting. He reached for his pistol, drawing it in a swift movement. The bride gasped. The townsfolk screamed. The sheriff shouted for everyone to get down. But the warrior moved faster, leaning to the side, his hands snapping outward with practiced precision. The horse lunged forward at the exact right moment, knocking the rider's arm upward. The shot fired wildly into the sky, sending birds scattering from the rooftops. Chaos exploded. People ducked behind barrels and wagons. Some ran, some screamed. Dust kicked up as feet scrambled for safety. The bride stood frozen, her breath trapped inside her chest. She wanted to move, but couldn't. The rider who fired cursed and tried to steady his aim again. But the warrior's horse spun, blocking the shot once more. The lead rider barked orders at the wagon men, telling them to grab what they needed before the sheriff regained control. The groom, pale with shock, shouted something about protecting the town. But no one listened to him anymore. The warrior called out sharply in his own language, a powerful sound that cut through the panic. The bride didn't know what he said, but she felt its intent. She took a step toward him, ready to move where he guided. But before she reached him, one of the wagon men lunged toward her direction, maybe to grab her, maybe to take the crates behind her. But the sudden movement sent fear shooting through her spine. The warrior reacted instantly. Pulling the reins hard and angling his horse between her and the man, the horse reared with a fierce cry, and the wagon man stumbled back, hands raised. The warrior's eyes burned with warning. The bride felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the realization that he would shield her even while facing danger from all sides. The sheriff fired a warning shot into the air, yelling for everyone to drop their weapons. For a moment, the riders hesitated. The sound echoed down the dusty main street. People peeked from behind cover, trembling. The groom stumbled back toward the church, trying to regain some semblance of authority by shouting to protect the bride. Though he had done nothing to actually shield her, the warrior kept his horse angled protectively. But then something strange happened. One of the riders tilted his head, staring at the bride with a look that made her blood run cold. He muttered something to his companions, something the townsfolk couldn't understand, but the warrior reacted sharply, his expression twisting into sudden alarm. She realized then that her position in this rising conflict wasn't by accident. She had somehow become more important than she understood. The riders kept glancing between her and the warrior, as if trying to piece together a new plan now that the original had shifted. She suddenly felt exposed, like a piece on a board she didn't know she was standing on. The lead rider smirked and announced loudly that if the warrior wanted peace, he would hand over what they came for. And if he didn't, they would take something else instead. His eyes slid toward her again with slow purpose. The warrior stiffened. The tension in the air tightened like a rope pulled between two strong hands. The bride stepped back, fear whispering through her bones. She had seen many kinds of men in her life. But the look in that rider's eyes was something different. Something cruel. Something willing to use her as leverage. The warrior moved his horse closer to her. Close enough that she could reach up and touch his leg if she dared. He didn't speak, but his presence told her everything she needed to know. He wouldn't let them take her. He wouldn't let them lay a hand on her. For reasons she didn't fully understand, he would protect her above all else. More riders appeared from the far edge of town, kicking up clouds of dust. The townsfolk panicked again. The sheriff shouted for backup from whoever could still move without trembling. The groom yelled at the bride, insisting this was all her fault for running at the altar. But she didn't listen. She only watched the warrior, the only steady point in the storm. The riders spread out, circling the center of town. The crates on the wagon seemed to glow with quiet danger, their contents still unknown, but clearly powerful enough to spark all this conflict. The bride felt her heart twist with fear and confusion. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand what the warrior had brought with him, what he had taken from these men, and why her life now hung in the balance. The warrior looked at her then, not with fear, not with regret. With resolve, he leaned forward slightly as if preparing for something. As if bracing for the moment everything would break open, the riders shouted again, pushing closer. The townsfolk shrank back. Dust hung in the air like a ghostly veil. The warrior reached out his hand toward her. Not an invitation this time, but in command, urging her to trust him, to move to him before the danger closed in. She took a shaky breath, her nails biting into her palms, her pulse pounding so loud it filled her ears. She stepped forward, and just as her hand touched the warrior's, a new sound cracked across the street, sharp and cutting, turning every head, tightening every muscle, and sending the entire town into a hush so deep it felt like the earth itself had stopped moving. The true danger had finally shown itself, and everything was about to change. The sharp sound that cracked across the street froze every soul in place. It wasn't a weapon firing this time. It was the splitting snap of wood giving way. One of the crates on the wagon burst open from the rough shoving of the riders crowding too close. The cloth fell aside, and the truth spilled into the light. Inside were rows of stolen blades and metal tools taken from nearby settlements. Items meant for trading and peace, but turned into profit for men who thrived on stirring trouble. The wagon men had been running supplies meant for the nearby ranchers and the Apache community, stealing from both sides to create distrust between them. The tension in town, the fear of raids, the unease around the warriors' people, all of it had been fed by these men who hoped the chaos would keep them rich. Gasps rose as the truth came into focus. Even the riders who had come for the crates faltered, caught off guard by the unexpected reveal. The sheriff's face hardened with understanding. People who had once feared the warrior now stared at the crates with shame and disbelief. The groom stumbled backward, the truth shaking the false confidence he'd clung to for so long. He muttered something about not knowing, but no one cared enough to listen. The warrior didn't waste a second. With the truth finally visible to everyone, he did what he had come for. He leaned down, gripping the bride's wrist as gently as a man can in the middle of danger, and lifted her onto the front of his horse. She clung to him, heart racing, her breath trembling against his chest. The horse moved like a creature born for storms, steady and strong beneath them both. The riders closest to the wagon shouted threats, but their plans had unraveled. The sheriff stepped forward with newfound authority, pointing his weapon at the wagonmen and ordering them to drop theirs. The townsfolk, now seeing clearly who had brought trouble into their lives, stepped forward to support their sheriff, blocking any escape. The riders still circling the center of town hesitated. They had come expecting a simple show of dominance. They hadn't expected the truth to fall open in front of everyone. The warrior didn't draw a weapon even then. Instead, he shouted in his own language toward the ridge, and moments later, more of his people emerged from the tree line, appearing like silent guardians. They had been waiting, watching, making sure the warrior didn't face danger alone. Their presence made the riders freeze completely. The balance of power shifted. For once, no one in town felt fear. They felt relief. The rider who had first pulled the buckskin glanced around, finally realizing he had no way out. He dropped the rolled hide in the dust and raised his hands. The others followed, grumbling curses as the sheriff's men restrained them. The crates were closed again and secured, this time under the sheriff's care. The tension that had wrapped itself around the town for months began to slip away. The bride finally felt like she could breathe again. Her hands were still shaking, but she wasn't afraid. She was safe in the arms of the man who had protected her without speaking a single word. The warrior looked down at her, his expression softer now, the storm in his eyes fading into calm. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she wasn't going back to the life she almost married herself into. The groom approached, still furious and embarrassed. He demanded she return to him and that the wedding continued. His voice wavered with desperation, not authority. But she didn't hide behind anyone this time. She asked him plainly why he still insisted on a marriage built on control. Why he thought her life belonged to him, and why he ignored her voice for so long. He had no answer. Only silence and bitterness. The townsfolk looked at him with disappointment, seeing now what the bride had tried to hide. The marriage had been arranged on one side only, not on both. The groom finally realized he had lost her. It's not because the warrior had taken her, but because he had never listened to her in the first place. He walked away, shoulders heavy, pride bruised, but no longer a danger. The warrior lowered her gently from the horse as the town calmed. She stood in the dust, her white dress stained, her veil tangled, but her heart stronger than ever. She looked up at him, uncertain what to say. He crouched to pick up the buckskin the rider had dropped. When he unrolled it for her, she saw drawings that told a story of stolen goods, disrupted peace, and efforts to blame the Apache for crimes they didn't commit. He handed it to the sheriff, who nodded with gratitude. The sheriff thanked the warrior for revealing the truth. People who had once avoided looking at him stepped forward with hesitant apologies. The warrior accepted them quietly, though he didn't linger on their words. His focus rested on the bride, as if she were the only person who mattered to him. When the riders and wagon men were escorted away, the streets slowly returned to quiet. The church bell hung still, the crowd dispersing into murmurs of relief. But no one forgot the sight of the warrior riding in to protect the woman who had been promised away against her will. They understood now why he had come. He didn't act out of pride or defiance. He acted out of purpose. The bride stepped closer to him, her hands clasped in front of her. She asked him why he had watched the town for so many days. Why he had appeared at the church at the exact moment she needed him most? He answered in a calm voice, telling her he had seen the wagon men weeks earlier near the ridge, carrying items they had no rightful claim to. He had followed them, hoping to prevent the trouble they intended to provoke. And when he saw her standing at the church doorway, he understood the danger had reached her too. She felt warmth bloom in her chest. He hadn't come to take her. He had come to save her, not just from the wagon men, but from a life that wasn't her choice. The townsfolk watched them quietly, unsure what to expect. Some wondered if she would leave with him. Others wondered if he would stay. But she knew her heart, fragile yet growing stronger with each breath she took beside him. She asked him gently if she could go with him, if he would show her the truth of the world beyond the town's borders, the land he protected, and the people who lived by choice, not by force. His expression softened, and he nodded once, the smallest gesture carrying the deepest meaning. He helped her onto the horse again, this time with ease and calm, not urgency. She sat behind him, her hands resting at his waist, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift completely. The sheriff watched with understanding. He told the warrior he was welcome to return any time, and that the town owed him more than they could express. The warrior acknowledged him with a respectful tilt of his head before guiding the horse forward. The bride looked back once as they rode away, watching the church grow smaller behind her. She didn't feel regret. She didn't feel fear. She felt free. The path ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't alone. She rode with a man who had shown her more courage in one morning than she had seen in years. A man who listened without speaking, who protected without demanding anything in return. She rested her cheek lightly against his back, letting the wind lift the last pieces of doubt from her heart as the horse carried them toward the open land. The sun broke through the clouds, washing the fields in warm light. The world felt larger than before, full of promise and new beginnings. She didn't know what stories waited ahead, but she knew one truth with absolute certainty. The life she was riding toward was hers, and she had chosen it freely. With the warrior who had changed everything in a single moment of courage and fate, together, they disappeared into the horizon, carrying hope, protection, and a future built not on demands, but on choice and trust. And that, at last, was the happy ending she had never thought she would have.